Okay, well, I guess it is 12:30 Eastern time, so it's time for us to get going. Hi, my name is Christian Bourque. I'm Executive Vice President at Leger, and I'll let then Stuart introduce himself as well.
Hello, I'm Stuart Soroka. I'm a professor in the Department of Communication and Media and in Political Science at the University of Michigan.
All right, perfect. Thank you. Thank you for being with us, Stuart. What I'll do first is show you some data over the pandemic period that not all has to do with Canada-US borders, but basically gets at Canada-US relationship and how the border issue has played into this pandemic period as well. Briefly, we'll finish up on data that comes from a very similar survey that we've conducted every 2 weeks now since the start of the pandemic with the Association for Canadian Studies. So every 2 weeks, we sample 1,500 Canadians or so, and over 1,000 Americans at the same time using the same questions. The latest data that we'll show you today was actually collected the weekend of June 20th. So it's a brand new data on where we stand on the Canada-US border and looking at the perspective from both sides as well into the data. So both surveys that we do every 2 weeks are run through our own web panels in both countries, and basically allows us to sort of shed light on how Canadians and Americans have sort of lived through this pandemic and this very unique period in both our collective histories. We'll start with in April 2020. Very early on in this pandemic, Canadians reacted very negatively to what they perceived as being sort of a very slow approach from the federal government and taking too much time in closing the border with both the United States, but also with other countries as well. And very early in the pandemic, we're in April 2020, sort of a month and a half into lockdown in Canada. And as the old saying goes, when the US sneezes, Canada catches a cold. And we basically asked a simple question. Do you think that the current situation in the United States will have an impact on the propagation of the virus here in Canada? And fully 2/3 of Canadians said yes. Of course, if the US sneezes, Canada will catch a cold. And if you look at the data across the country, really no major regional differences, no differences by age. So collectively, 2 out of 3 people in Canada felt that whatever would be happening with the spread of COVID-19 down south would basically directly influence the disease and its propagation here in Canada. Now, when you ask the question in reverse, do you think that the situation in Canada will have an impact on the United States? Probably half of Americans said, what? Remind me where Canada is exactly, because we do have a very different portrait. So if 2 out of 3 Canadians said, yes, of course, I will be worried about what goes on in the States. And we remember during wave 1, when the propagations and the spread starting to go through the roof in the United States, it did worry Canadians to a large extent, and that's what is seen here. Whereas in the United States, only 19% of Americans felt that whatever was happening with the disease here in Canada would potentially have an impact on Americans. So we can see how that probably would have an impact on how people see border closings between the two countries. Half of Americans were basically saying, I don't know if it will have an impact in the United States. And if we added an I don't care category to this question, probably that would be representative of some of the opinion that is expressed here. So very different perspectives on how people saw that the propagation of the virus in one country could affect the other. A month after we asked our first questions about the reopening of the border, Canadians had been very critical of the Trudeau administration up here, saying that it was too slow at closing the border with the US. But in late May, we need to remember this is post wave 1. We're coming out of our first lockdown. Restaurants are reopening again. And we believe that maybe this is it, right? Maybe wave 1 is the end of the pandemic as we knew it. So we did ask back then, do you think we should reopen borders with the United States? In Canada, 5% said, we should do that right now. Some said at the end of June, so even early in the summer. Some said not before the fall in September, and half of them said not before end of 2020. At that time, again, we are sort of post wave 1 in a very sort of different mindset that we were later on in the year and early into 2021. So again, consensus in Canada that it was not time to reopen the border back last summer. When we actually look at the US data, Americans were more divided on this issue. 18% said we should reopen them now. This is last summer, of course, not this summer. 26% said at the end of June, we should be fine. And then about half of Americans said either after September or not before the end of 2020. But if you look at the data sort of collectively, there was no rush last summer to actually consider reopening the border back in 2020. What is interesting when you look at this data, sort of one layer into it, it did not show up too much in this data. But what we basically have is everything sort of falls along ideological lines in both countries. Those who wanted the reopening of the border in Canada last year tended to vote Conservative or would support the Conservatives. And in the US, those who were more open to reopening the border with the US more quickly tended to be Republican as well. And where you found most opposition in Canada was sort of Ontario moving east, and it was the same in the United States. Opposition to reopening the border with Canada was much higher in the eastern corridor for the United States as well. Now we move into July 2020. So we are still in this period where we're reopening, gradually reopening the economy after wave one. And we asked a slightly different question, but aimed at the same topic. Do you agree or disagree with the reopening of the borders between Canada and the United States at the end of July? Because again, we were sort of reopening, both were reopening their economy back in the summer. Back then, only 11% of Canadians agreed that it was time to reopen the border. Again, very strong resistance to this idea that we should, or that we were ready back then to reopen the borders. But again, Canadians have had a very sort of dim perspective on the propagation of COVID-19 down in the United States compared to what they felt their situation was better here in Canada. And again, if you compared both countries, by mid-July 2020, half of Americans said, I agree we should reopen the border now. And the other half either disagreed or were not sure or did not want to commit on that issue. And again, if you looked at the data for the United States, even more striking because we were sort of fairly divided on this issue back in July 2020, that half of Americans who agreed with reopening the border tended to be Republicans, tended to be from the Midwest and the South, whereas those on both coasts in the United States tended to be against reopening the border. And in Canada, again, the few that agreed we should reopen the border tended to be more likely to support the Conservative Party of Canada. Again, when we look at that data and the differential between the two countries, one thing is striking as well is that in Canada itself, there were very few regional differences, but in the United States, those variances were actually very important between different regions of the country. Whoops, I don't know why it keeps going back. Okay, sorry about that. One other thing, when we think about Canada-US relationships during that pandemic period, one element was, of course, the impact of perceptions of the pandemic in both countries and how it played into Canada-US relationships. But we can't basically not discuss the elephant in the room, which was, of course, the presidential election in the United States and the actual outcome, the events at the Capitol, and all that we know and remember from that period. But we wanted to see if Canadians were not really keen on reopening the border with the US, and to some extent, half of Americans were saying the same thing back. Was the election of a Democrat president and a new administration coming in January, how would that impact Canada-US relationships? We first asked, do you think that the election of Joe Biden as president will improve, worsen, or have no change on Canada-US relations? In Canada, 61% of people said it will improve relationships between the two countries. There had been tensions between Prime Minister Trudeau and President Trump in the past as well during the last administration. Renegotiation of the free trade agreement between the three countries. So Canadians tended to be fairly positive about the impact of Joe Biden coming in as the new president of the United States. And again, if you looked at this chart, ideologically, 61%, those 61% tended to be center to left wing supporters, whereas some supporters of the Conservative Party of Canada would then actually feel that this would make relationships worse or have no impact on relationship with our southern neighbor. In the United States, there was also some element of enthusiasm about the election of Joe Biden, with 43% of Americans believing that it would have a positive impact on relationships between the two countries. But again, that 43% was basically Democratic voters again. So blue states said things would get better. Red states either said it would worsen the relationship between the two countries or have no real impact on them at all. You need to remember that in Canada, when we polled on it right before the actual election in the United States, 83% of Canadians said they would have voted for Joe Biden if they were allowed to vote in US elections. And I would argue most Canadians feel we should be able to vote in US elections for that matter. We also ask questions related to sort of policy. What's interesting too from a Canadian perspective is that they believe that the positive impact of Joe Biden coming in as a new president would make this sort of recovery period from in terms of the US economy, that would need to be made sort of green and basically be about slowing down and reducing carbon emissions in the US. Whereas from an American perspective, there is very much a deep division between that 37% who say President Biden should make significant steps in reducing carbon emissions in the US, and 40% who say, grow the economy regardless. This is what we need now. And of course, blue states said, agreed with the first statement, red states agreed with the second. Very much sort of a deep division based on ideology. Again, when we actually looked at what the Biden presidency would mean in terms of Canada-US relationships in the short term, we asked a question then specifically about the state of the economy for both Canada and the United States. This is where we see that we do not have the same sort of rose-tinted glasses in Canada. Here, 29% said it will improve our economy in Canada, the fact that Joe Biden is president. 20% felt it would worsen our economy, and some said it would have no change or did not know exactly where to side on that issue. Mind you, when we did that study, it was about a week or 10 days after he announced his Buy America plan as well, and that may have had some influence on the Canadian data. In terms of the American perspective, then, of course, deep division, 39% say it will improve, 37% worsen, and it would fall almost perfectly on ideological lines as well. So now we'll get into some issues related to how we feel about the border now. One thing that is interesting, there's one element of data that we've tracked with ACS since the start of the pandemic. The first data point was in late March of 2020. We asked a fairly simple question. When it comes to the COVID-19 crisis, do you believe, and the black line is the worst of the crisis is behind us. The red line is we are in the worst of the crisis now. And the gray line is the worst of the crisis is yet to come. When we look at the data in the United States, you can clearly see the three waves of the pandemic. And as we got sort of later in wave one, heading into the summer, June 2020, those feeling that the worst of the crisis was behind us were gaining traction, whereas those who felt the worst of the crisis was right now were started sliding down. So end of wave one in the data corresponds exactly to end of wave one in actual fact. Then we see when we get into late summer, early fall, we see a return in terms of those who feel that or feeling that the worst of the crisis was right now, whereas those who felt the worst of the crisis was behind them were actually sort of declining and lower. So, and again, this data point here in early November would be the end of wave two. And then we see the same thing happening when wave three comes in. We see that the line of those who say we are living the worst of the crisis now was actually sort of climbing back up. Until we get to this point, where the data sort of flips over, which basically for the US is early March of this year. So by looking at this data, something's happening very early on in March in terms of the data, where we see that right now Americans starting in March are saying, hey, this thing is behind us. We've seen the worst of it. We're coming out of it. If we look at the exact same tracking data for Canada, we see a very different perspective. Again, much the same, we see that at the peak of wave one, we see Canadians saying that we are in the worst of the crisis now. As soon as we get to early June, then basically they are saying, well, the worst is behind us. And this sort of declines until we get to sort of wave two and then wave three of the pandemic. But the point at which the data flips, same as what we saw for early March in the United States, actually happens almost mid-June in Canada. So there's about a almost a 3-month delay in terms of the mindset of Canadians being at the same place as the mindset of Americans on the pandemic itself. And what we see in the data is we sort of have a wave 3 that was in 2 phases in Canada. Here, sort of everybody felt that the worst was actually happening right now. There were no differences regionally in Canada back then. Then we see that things are improving out east and in Quebec and to some extent in Ontario, but they're actually worse out west in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, which sort of maintained these fairly high numbers of people saying that the worst of the crisis was right now. And then we get to a point in the data that's similar to the US where finally the worst of this crisis is behind us. But that 3-month delay probably, or we should expect, would have an impact on how people feel about reopening the border. We asked this question, the data was released on June 28th, where we said, do you think governments should lift all restrictions related to COVID-19 right now? Of course, we believe the majority of people would say no to this at the point in time that we asked, because we wanted to see how we track this moving forward throughout this summer, this upcoming summer. But in Canada, 69% of people are saying, no, we do not, or we should not lift restrictions related to COVID. Now, over a month when we asked this question, from late May to late June, it basically has not changed. Barely a +1 in terms of the people who say, yes, we should reopen and lift all restrictions related to COVID-19. So again, we see a very sort of late, very careful, prudent response from Canadians that we are not necessarily seeing in the US data. In the same period, when we asked the same question to Americans, again, very much divided on the issue of should we lift all restrictions right now in the United States. And that 40% here is mostly, again, the 2 coasts in the US, mostly blue states, mostly Democratic supporters. What we have in the red here is actually red states and sort of Midwest South voters in the United States saying that, yes, we should reopen, and Democrats saying, no, we should not. So again, very deep ideological lines when it comes to that issue in the US right now. But even today in the United States, there is no consensus that we should, fill the baseball stadium again, or that we should reopen the economy exactly the way it was, or that we should lift all restrictions. Very much still division. And again, probably will weigh in terms of how state legislatures actually make decisions coming up, or have made decisions up until now. Something that we are not really seeing in Canada. Those who say that, yes, we should lift all restrictions tend to be from Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, which again, more sort of the sort of true Tory right of center vote in Canada. But there is still a consensus and a majority in all regions of Canada who say that, no, it is not time to lift restrictions yet in this country. So we get to our same question about borders early June in 2021. Would you support or oppose a reopening of the borders between Canada and the United States this summer? And asking again in both countries. Here we see that support for reopening the border in 2021 is better than support that we saw in Canada in 2020. Still a good 10 points better than it was back then. Today, 36% of Canadians say that, yes, we should reopen the border this summer. Still 64 oppose. In the United States, the reverse is really happening. 8 out of 10 believe that would support reopening the border. Only 22 oppose that move in the United States. When we further ask after that question, for what reasons would you like to see the border reopened? 3%, only 3% of Canadians say, well, it's to allow Americans to travel to Canada. 31% say, oh, it's to allow us to travel to the States. And 66 feel it should go both ways, to allow both Americans in and Canadians in on the other side. In the US, we pretty much have a different picture again. What we see is 82% of Americans feel that, hey, if we reopen the border, it goes both ways equally. So still, we see some elements of resistance as well in Canada on this issue of reopening the border. So we get to our latest data collected just 10 days ago in both Canada and the United States. So we are post wave 3. We're reopening the economy in both countries at different rates and making different decisions again, but pretty much the mood seems to be similar. But again, Canadians have this sort of 3-month delay in feeling good about this whole thing that we saw a minute ago. And we asked of Canadians, do you think we should reopen the border with the United States right now? Only 12%. In a few weeks, so sometime during the summer at 20%, not before the end of the summer at 32%, and not before the end of 2021 for another 35%. So we still have about 67% of Canadians who basically want to delay further this issue of reopening the border with the United States. And if you look across Canada, there's not really that much variance between the different regions. It maybe is a tad higher at 19% in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, a little bit higher, but not significantly in Alberta, as well at 17%. Then the others are basically just making it to the teens, not even making it to the teens in the other regions of the country. So again, fairly sort of consensual in this perspective that there is no rush to reopen the border between two countries. When we ask the same questions of Americans, if we should reopen the border with Canada, Americans, again, at 31% say we should do that right now. 21% say it should be done in the next few weeks. And then we have about 49% who either believe it should be done at the end of the summer or in the fall. So even if Americans are much more open to this idea of reopening the border between the two countries, there is still some resistance at 49%, still fairly important as well. And if we look at regional differences, they're not as important now in the US as they were. As we see that there's more openness to reopening the border, then the sort of the difference between the Northeast and the South and the West are not that important as well. If you compare the two countries, we see that there are variances that are fairly important. But from a Canadian perspective, if I was reading this data, somewhere in Prime Minister Trudeau's cabinet, I would say, you know what, we can do whatever we want. There's absolutely no rush. Pressure to reopen the border right now will not come from the Canadian public. In the United States, again, much more sort of divided on this issue, but again, more appetite to have things the way they were. What about some conditions? Here we see from a Canadian perspective, 63% say the only people we allow in need to demonstrate that they're fully vaccinated. 14% say they should show a negative COVID test when they get to the border. Some 13% believe it should be like it's been over the past year, which is we only allow in essential workers, humanitarian workers, or emergency workers, pretty much the same situation that we've seen over the past year, sort of letting trucks move goods back and forth, but that's about it. And 9% said, if you at least have one dose, you can come into the country. If we move that to the United States, pretty much the same picture. 57% of Americans believe that if we do let Canadians in, they need to be fully vaccinated. This is significantly higher in the Northeast, which of course has pretty much the highest vaccination rate in the US right now. And then if you look at those need to be showing sort of a negative COVID test, that we only allow in emergency workers, and those with only one dose, we do see that both countries tend to feel the same way. We basically are moving people that are fully vaccinated from one country to the other. Again, very little difference in the data between the two countries on this single issue. Now, Canadians are late to the game when it comes to actually getting out of the safety measures. You could probably say there's a bit of a stereotype with how Canadians are prudent, careful, and maybe not as carefree as Americans would like us to be. So only 4% of Canadians have made plans to travel outside Canada. This is sort of late June, just about 10 days ago. So Canadians are not ready to go back to traveling yet. So again, if they don't feel like going down south for a vacation or to visit the in-laws, they're not putting pressure on policymakers to actually reopen the border as well. This question was not asked of Americans as well, but we can see that Canadians are not there yet. We also asked one last question. If you are to travel again, what should we do about the duty-free limits that are right now enforced in this country? And Canadians tend to believe that we should either increase it or have it stay the same. But again, Canadians not ready to travel yet. So at the point in time where we are today, again, Americans much more open to reopening the border than Canadians are at the moment. Again, this is it for me. I've already spoken too much, Stuart, but certainly would welcome your comments as well and your insights on what this means in terms of relationship between the two countries, and what can we expect about this reopening of the Canada-US border moving forward.
Thanks very much, Christian. That was really interesting. It was the tracking data, the time series data you have, I just think is fascinating. I think it's really terrific. And thank you for to the association and you for giving me an opportunity to speak here. I actually got, I have two kind of background things to say before I'll talk about the data. The first is that I was invited to join this conference while I was in line at the Canadian border. So I've just come from quarantine in my mother's basement. I have some strong opinions about current state of Canadian policy on borders. I'll try not to let those filter into my comments about the slides, but know that that's what's behind this. And I'm happy to talk about that policy and also what it's like to move back into your mother's basement if people would like to during questions. I also want to preface this by saying that I do have an inclination to see similarity rather than difference when I'm looking at Canadian attitudes and Americans' attitudes. That's my own personal bias. I think it's a bias informed by data, but that's, of course I think that. So I just want to note that I'm about to say something predictable, given what I have said about, for instance, the state of Canadians versus Americans' attitudes on healthcare or immigration, in which I have written that there is as much similarity as there is difference. Here I see roughly the same pattern. I think that we can look at these opinion data, or at least I'm thinking when I'm looking at these opinion data, I'm thinking about them. I'm trying to decide whether what I want to see them as is as a kind of driver or constraint on public policy, like what's possible in terms of public policy given the state of public attitudes, or alternatively to see public opinion more as a kind of test of the reasonableness or the accuracy of available information, the reasonableness of citizens in their responses to that information, and or the accuracy of information. To what extent has public opinion in the US and in Canada on issues of the pandemic and borders? To what extent do we see a kind of rationality to that or not? And my emphasis here is going to be mostly on the latter perspective. Like, do we see patterns here that reflect what we would expect to see if people were getting sufficiently accurate information and responding rationally to that sufficiently accurate information? And to the extent that I see differences and similarities here, I think that it mostly supports the idea, mostly supports the argument that Canadian and American publics are not fundamentally different in their thinking on these issues and have, for the most part, been responding rationally to the available information over the past 15 months or so. So let me give you some examples. In April 2020, a majority of Canadians believe the current situation in the US will have an impact on propagation of the virus in Canada. Roughly 19% of Americans believe the inverse is true. That's probably accurate. We've got a country that's 10 times the size of another country. It's perfectly reasonable given it's perfectly reasonable for Canadians to believe the American situation is going to affect them more than Americans think the Canadian situation is going to affect them. Just consider, for instance, the proportion of those populations that live butted up against the border with those countries. A huge portion of Canadians within a border, a less huge proportion of Americans within very close to the border. In May 2020, a majority of Canadians support closing the border at least until the fall and perhaps the end of the year. Americans are somewhat less supportive of long-term closure. That fits again with what I would see as a pretty rational reaction given the distribution of populations and the difference in populations across the two countries. In July 2020, the vast majority of Canadians do not support reopening the border. A minority of Americans is strongly opposed. Again, this reflects exactly the same pattern, right? If you took, here's the kind of counterfactual in my head is, imagine you took exactly the same people and you just switched their context. Would public opinion look roughly the same? Or is there something fundamentally different about Canadian minds versus American minds? I think the latter is not the case. If you took these people and just switched their situations, you might imagine American support, if America was small and Canada was big, American support for an open border would go down and Canada's support would go up because the potential impact of an open border is smaller. Those long-term trends, which I totally love, I think that's a really unique and valuable body of data. But those long-term trends roughly reflect the severity of the pandemic in the two countries over time, and the kind of inflection point in the U.S. in March fits with the moment when Americans could start getting vaccinated, like reliably vaccinated, as in, I, for instance, was vaccinated in March. So if you were older or middle-aged and ambitious with a good internet connection, you were getting vaccinated in March in the US, and that's where we see this inflection point. That's the kind of moment at which Americans start thinking, okay, this is going to get better, because now vaccines are readily available, and we all felt that, well, many of us felt that vaccines were readily available. In Canada, you have an inflection point that's delayed because that is the point at which vaccines start. That's the point at which we start hearing announcements in Canada about the kind of ready availability of vaccines, as opposed to a slow trickling out of vaccines to more limited populations. So that strikes me again as a rational, reasoned reaction to available information. In June 2021. Americans and Canadians differ in support for reopening the borders sooner rather than later. Both countries agree that being fully vaccinated and or showing a negative COVID test are important. So what I see there is there's a difference in the size of these two countries. There's a difference in the perceived impact of one country's population on another country's population. That accounts for some of the difference, if not a lot of the difference, that we see in aggregate attitudes about vaccination. And actually, the countries barely differ at all the populations barely differ at all in their beliefs about the need for vaccination in order to cross the border. So I think there's a fair bit of similarity here. What we see is in my view, more a kind of practical reaction to information than ideological. Now, that's not to say that there aren't ideological differences within each country. There clearly are. There's a lot of variation, and Christian has pointed that out. And of course, the variation in the US is really kind of explicit and obvious. But when we take the populations as a whole, as an aggregate, the kind of movement over time and the distribution of attitudes, and in my view, doesn't seem fundamentally different across these two countries, given their quite different situations. So that, to me, introduces two kind of interesting kind of take-home messages. The first is, at least, now the most recent, there are people here who will know better than I, but the most recent data I could get was from 2009, 2010. Although the American population is roughly 10 times the size of the Canadian population, in terms of cross-border, in terms of people crossing the border, my impression is in border towns that the Canadians coming to the US versus Americans coming to Canada, in terms of crossings, it's a the Canadian number is roughly twice as big as the American number. So actually, in terms of crossing, more Canadians are crossing than Americans are crossing. I wonder what that information would do to people's attitudes. How much of this is about the kind of the perceived impact of a country given its population versus the perceived impact of a country given how many people are coming across. Now, I don't know that that's individuals crossing the border. It could be the same Canadians crossing the border over and over again, but that's it. I don't know how to play with that, but that strikes me as an interesting kind of thought experiment. The other message that I get from this is maybe more useful, is that given that we see a degree of rationality, I think, in Canadians and Americans' attitudes about COVID and borders, I think that this kind of slide deck is a really important kind of prodding or signal that the kind of quality and accuracy of information from media and from government sources needs to be, is really, really critical. As in, because we see that citizens are responding, I think, rationally to information, that information is of real significance. I can say, and now I'll use some personal experience, I can say, as someone who lives in Michigan with family in Ontario, we've experienced very different government messaging about the pandemic. And that messaging has been really critical to the way in which we have felt and managed the pandemic. And the kind of rationality that we see in Christian's data here suggests to me that that messaging can be really, really important. People respond to it.
Actually, Stuart, if you don't mind, I already see we have a couple of questions in the Q&A section of the platform. And I guess we're ready to open it up to questions now. So please do not hesitate to put your questions in. I guess we'll get to the first one. Somebody is asking, was the question about vacationing outside Canada only referred to going to the US or anywhere else in the world? And did the survey include newcomers? The first portion is yes. So it was plans to travel outside Canada. So it included any other country, which of course for Canadians, a fairly sizable component, traveling outside Canada means to the US, but it was open to traveling across the world. The issue with newcomers is with the overall sample size that we have. If we were to slice it out, and only look at newcomers, the sample size would be too small, certainly for the US as well. We do have a larger component of people who are immigrants, but that would also include people that have been here for 30, 40 years. And again, we would be hardly could get at that issue of newcomers specifically. So unfortunately, there's other data that we've collected with the University of Manitoba that has much larger sample sizes and over samples of newcomers. But I do not believe we asked that same question exactly in that data. But here we can't go into that level of detail given the overall sample size. Sorry. The other question is interesting, and this is something that was debated yesterday, Stuart, at the conference. And I'll turn the question over to you if you do not mind. So while your survey shows that the Canadians and Americans are in no rush to open the border between US and Canada, US border mayors and Canada border mayors who spoke at a session an hour back were strongly in favor of opening the border soon. How do you explain differences, and how do you see policy shifting as those directly impacted by border closing speak out, but then the broader public seems either in no rush or maybe to some extent indifferent?
I mean, I think this is the answer. I think there are a few different answers. The answers that I'm most attracted to is as follows. I'm not sure we should use public opinion to make this kind of public health policy. So I'm inclined to view these when I said at the beginning that I'm inclined to view this public opinion as how are people reacting? Are they reacting rationally to reasonably accurate information? I wanted to view it that way rather than, is this the public opinion that we should use to inform policy? On complex scientific issues, I think we should use science to inform policy, not public opinion. Our hope should be there's really good science, there's really good open government informed scientific and policymaking debate about the issue. They make a sensible decision and they are then held accountable to that. They're then held accountable for that sensible decision by a sufficiently informed public. That I think is the right thing to do in the context of a pandemic where we don't expect everyone just wandering down the street to know exactly how to deal with a pandemic. So my inclination is to say, look, I imagine that mayors of border towns have a lot of really good information about the state of the pandemic, about the efficacy of vaccinations and the economic consequences uh, for closing the border. My inclination is to say that mayors probably have a pretty good sense for this state of affairs, whereas the public has like a limited sense for the state of affairs. And that to me is probably what's driving that difference.
Mm-hmm. And too bad that politicians may get into the way of making decisions only based on science, but that's life. Somebody is asking a question as well. Can we do an anthology over the next 12 to 18 months on how COVID-19 has affected relationship between the two countries? We have never had sort of this length of a border closing in our collective histories as well. And that also happened at the same time as a transition between Trump and Biden. How would you see Canada-US relations moving forward if we are moving out of this pandemic? And we'll see about the new variant impact on that. But if we are moving out of the pandemic period, how will those two historical events, the Trump to Biden transition, but also having our two countries being sort of close to one another for 15 months? Not an easy one.
Yeah, that the difficulty speaking as a social scientist, the difficulty is that we had a transition from Trump to Biden during the pandemic. So it's very, very difficult to distinguish, to the extent that there are differences coming out of this, it's going to be really, really hard to distinguish what is a consequence of the pandemic versus what is a consequence of like a fundamental shift in the way in which the U.S. government functions. I don't know how to separate out those two things. It will take smarter people than I to do that, although I'm sure they exist. I don't know, what's your reaction to that question?
Yeah, as you were saying, it's almost as if we needed a control group where only one of the two conditions existed, and that will never happen, of course. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people will want to ponder as this made us move further away from one another or closer to one another in a way. I would be tempted to say that probably the biggest impact on relationship between the two countries is the likely outcome of the US presidential election. During those 4 years when we polled on Canadian perceptions of America, we were seeing a lot more cynicism, some negative perceptions of Canada. Even speaking amongst your friends who say, "Well, I can't visit. It's a red state. I can't go," or some people saying, "I will not travel to the States until they get rid of." So I think there was a layer of that form of negativity in Canada that probably existed pre-pandemic. But again, I'm the same as you. If we were having a second term of a Trump presidency and the pandemic was coming to an end, probably my initial hypothesis would be that the countries are sort of moving apart. But to me, that was political before it was related to a public health issue. But the outcome, as you say, is in order to isolate the impact of the pandemic and sort of breaking this sort of forever Canadians and Americans have moved back and forth pretty much freely between the two countries. It's tough to isolate that specific component and what its impact actually may have been.
We need the border town mayors for that question.
Mm.
I imagine that in those towns there may be durable changes that they're
Mm-hmm.
able to see that are a consequence of the closing and the way in which things are reopening.
Yep. We have some further questions as well. Did the day for Canadians who haven't booked a vacation yet reflect attitudes of Canadians in the sense that they are not in favor of the border reopening, or not optimistic that the government will reopen borders soon? That is a very good question. Certainly from a Canadian perspective, I think there's probably a lot more Canadians who are ready to travel, but are waiting to see how long is this. Because again, Stuart, like you were saying, nobody wants to have that 14-day quarantine, either arriving in or coming back from. And I think a lot of Canadians are putting plans on hold to go to New York, just as they are going to Paris, because they do not know exactly or what would be the public policy issues that will affect their vacation or family time that they are planning. So I would agree that they're probably attitudinally a lot of Canadians who are ready to travel, but are just waiting for the go signal from a federal government who again is taking its time again on this issue as well.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think we can infer anything about whether Canadians support or don't support border opening from their not going away. They're not going away because it seems much more likely that they're not leaving because when they come back, you have to quarantine for 14 days.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, until very recently, while I was in quarantine, until very recently, there was no signal of that changing. It was just another month, another month, another month, another month. That's an area in which we can really see, I suspect that's an area in which we can really see the impact of government messaging.
Absolutely.
If there was a clear timeline for the border opening up,
Mm-hmm.
then we could look at what Canadians were booking and have some sense for Canadians' inclinations to go abroad when things reopen. As it stands, it makes sense that nobody is leaving. At least they get to go to their own homes. As in, when Canadians return, they get to go to their own homes. Mm-hmm. Did I mention I just spent 2 weeks in my mother's basement?
and I'm sure you just love that, based on the way you say it.
I'm grateful.
Oh, we have other questions. We just had 4 of the mayors of the on the morning panel that they say that they're not being listened to, and they have vested economic interest that may make them less objective. Though I understand that Stuart says we should trust them.
Yeah, that's another answer, and an answer. You know, when I said there were multiple answers, that's another answer, and it's not that they have economic interests that make them biased, and we shouldn't listen to them. And I mean, maybe that, I don't know whether that's, I don't know which answer is more true. I'm inclined to believe my answer is more true, that they have all kinds of available information, but that's partly because I want to make a general argument about not using public opinion as the guide to policy in complex, totally unique public health care disasters. We don't turn to the public for an answer on how to deal with that. We should turn to science for an answer on how to deal with that. And so my inclination is to think, well, maybe the mayors have science and econometricians and all kinds of other people giving them useful information, so they're more adequately informed. I don't know if that's the case.
Okay.
But my inclination toward that storyline reflects a general bias, and that, you know, there are times when we should look to public opinion as a guide to policy, and times when we should not. And this is not one of those times.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Oh, there's a sort of a personal question to you, Stuart. Of course, Stuart, Canadian, taught at McGill for many years. As moving to the US made you feel more American or more Canadian?
It's made me feel less Canadian, but not necessarily more American. Is that a reasonable answer? I mean,
it is one of the possible answers.
It's endogenous, right? Because I moved here because I didn't feel a very strong attachment to either place. Like, I didn't feel so strongly attached to Canada that I couldn't imagine leaving it. So that was my inclination coming here. But keep in mind that, I mean, I moved here when I moved here, it was Obama's America. We were legalizing gay marriage, and it felt more liberal in Ann Arbor, Michigan, than in Montreal, far more liberal. And then things changed pretty dramatically, and now they're changing again. There are like big swings on this side of the border. But I like both.
Okay. Perfect. Somebody is asking, did your survey ask any questions about why Canadians or Americans support or oppose easing of travel restrictions? Not in this particular survey. When we asked earlier in the year, it was early 2021. Most, if not all, of the reasons were tied to fear of contracting the disease and propagation of the disease. And the second element was the whole issue of what are the safety measures in the host country I'm visiting versus the ones in my country when I come back. So it was a lot about what's the hassle of traveling versus traveling itself. But if not, most of the people that opposed were basically, it was solely about the threat of COVID-19. Somebody is asking as well, according to the survey, 57% of Americans said fully vaccinated Canadians should be allowed to cross the border, but many Canadians have received the AstraZeneca vaccine, a first dose at least, which is not approved in the US. How does this affect Americans' attitudes towards fully vaccinated Canadians? Hey, I'm an AZ first dose person. How would that affect me?
That's tough to know. I don't think we quite know the answer to that question, though I will note this, and it's based on personal experience and no data. But my own experience reading Canadian and US newspapers over the course of the pandemic, and then talking to family in Ontario and in Michigan, is that the debate about the different vaccines and I'll leave it at that. Debate about the different vaccines has just been much more frequent in Canada than it is in the US. It's just been, I think it's about the kind of the oversupply of domestically produced vaccines in the US made that, it wasn't that there was no discussion about the different vaccines, but actually relatively little. So my guess is we actually have to introduce to most Americans the idea that there are concerns about some vaccines in order to then extract their opinions about what those are. It just was not hasn't been a feature of the debate in the same, certainly not to the same degree that it's been in Canada.
And in Canada, a lot of that debate was fueled by the AstraZeneca issue in Europe and in Great Britain in particular, with their experience with AstraZeneca as well, which I'm sure you are right about Americans not getting sort of that deep into which one did you get and why does it matter so much compared to what we had here. Another question, and I guess we should be wrapping up fairly soon, but we certainly will answer this question as well. If the expectation of being fully vaccinated were to be the condition to cross US-Canada border, what measures would be placed to catch any false documents or confirmations? What about this idea of a vaccine passport? And could somebody sort of falsify? I have a QR code on my phone that says that I'm vaccinated. Is that legit? Could that be falsified? So interesting question as well.
I don't think we know the answer. I don't think that the falsification in the US is any more straightforward than falsification in Canada. I think you can falsify in either place, but I don't know.
And I haven't heard any of
our an expert in that area.
Yeah. None of our national governments, certainly not in Canada, have addressed this issue of should we have some of a joint document that both countries agree on. I haven't heard or seen that. Okay, one last one. Do you think, given the Democratic Republican split, that the US is more divided than Canada and more challenged in terms of managing the contagion?
That's a super interesting question. It's really hard to know the answer because so much of it depends on the movement of the disease into different parts of the country, right? So there were huge rural parts of America where people weren't getting vaccinated, and still aren't getting vaccinated, but also only 6 people have ever had COVID there. So in some areas of the US and in some areas of Canada, presumably, people aren't getting vaccinated, and that's of no real consequence, we would like them to get vaccinated, but it doesn't matter in the same way that if you were living in downtown LA, for instance, and not getting vaccinated might matter. So the distribution of populations makes things complicated. The evolution of the virus makes things complicated, and it's tough. I'm sure epidemiologists can model this, but it's tough for me to imagine what the different paths are moving forward if what you have is, say, 50 to 60% of a population twice vaccinated versus 30% of a population twice vaccinated and another 30% once vaccinated. I think it's super hard to predict.
Yeah.
There's political heterogeneity for sure, but it's unclear whether that will have a lasting problematic impact on whatever the next variant is.
Yeah, and when you look at the data sort of at a fairly high level, and your samples are not huge, the division between blue and red is pretty much the same as the division between urban and rural. So again, it's hard to differentiate which explains what.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. I guess we're already close to 1:30. I see there's no more questions. I guess first, thank you, Stuart, for taking the time and being with us today. I want to thank the audience as well for being there and listening into the conversation. And I guess I'll leave you sort of last words to you, Stuart.
Oh, I have no last words.
Thank you both for an engaging
really
session.
Fun to talk about these data. Hopefully, this will all seem like history in a few months.
Thank you both on behalf of everyone listening. Thanks very much for an engaging presentation.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.